Thank you very much, João and Pedro. The instructions were that this would be a conversation and we would simply talk. We are, I think the three of us, we have papers because we can no longer, after teaching and writing so many years, we can no longer speak without papers. No? So I will refer to some of my notes here. And first of all, I want to welcome all our colleagues from Brazil here. Some of us were fortunate enough to be in Sao Paulo for a wonderful meeting a couple of years ago, and I'm so happy that we can reciprocate or try to reciprocate a little bit here. I want to say right away that I consider it a great honor to be here with Deborah Jackson and with Serge Gruzinski, both of whom write with clarity and with a great deal of passion too, historical passion and anthropological passion and detail about the topics that we are going to be discussing. It's a great honor for me to be here with them. And I want to thank, of course, Pedro Meira, João Bill, Lily Schwartz, Antonio Sergio Guimarães from USP and for organizing this encounter here. Lily is our global scholar, and to thank also Nadia and Andre Botello, who have also written so much about slavery and post-slavery society, and Nadia Guimarães for her work and for her hospitality here too. It's a great honor to have all of you here. And I would like to perhaps maybe begin, because Pedro made a reference, and I also want to make that reference, that this is a very special day for many of us here, this gathering, and so well attended and with so many distinguished speakers, because Brazil was not always, let's say, on the horizon of Princeton University, although we were extremely fortunate to have, as founder of the program, Stanley Stein, the eminent and historian and dear friend who is here, and that was, we were so lucky to have him at Princeton and to meet him, those of us who came much later. And Jim Irby, my colleague in the old Romance Language Department and the Spanish and Portuguese Department, and also Albert Hirschman, whom I want to refer to. I was happy that you mentioned him too, because Albert Hirschman would have been extremely happy to see this gathering. He was always insisting on the need to make Brazil one of the centers of our Brazilian culture and politics, of our discussions at Princeton. And he was the only few times that I saw him a bit angry, if I can use that word, a bit upset, was because of the ignorance of Brazil and Brazilian issues at Princeton, and the lack of interest in Brazilian literature and some of the prominent scholars. And I want to remember him here. He wrote many books, and João mentioned one phrase. I'm going to refer to two that I think relevant for this discussion of citizenship. One is a small book, a treasure of a book, and the title is Getting Ahead Collectively, which is a very beautiful book based on Latin American research too, and his field trip to Latin America with Sarah Hirschman, his wife, and the notion of getting ahead, so American notion of getting ahead and progressing and just making it, but collectively, that adverb that changed the whole meaning, I think has a lot to do, or we can read it today as having to do with citizenship and participation and agency. And also a key concept, the art of trespassing, that he always referred to. No? He saw himself an intellectual endeavor as a continuous trespassing, crossing borders, movement, crossing boundaries, and I think that comparative studies and also to be critical of the abuse of the concept of border crossing. I think the idea of trespassing is a very good concept, I think, to think of mestizaje, to think of slavery and post-slavery, to think about citizenship, and to think about academic, I think, innovative research and thought. Disciplines, crossing disciplines, as we attempt to do in this case. And for Hirschman, I think it meant also how individuals and groups in the same society reflect on, desire, imagine, and strive also for personal and collective freedom. Trespassing, which I think has been very important was very important for him and for what he represented, and perhaps in his thought for different roads, not determined for democracy, which I think is at the core of the discussion that we have or hope to have today. And his biographer, who is here, our dear colleague, also Jeremy Edelman, has now, fortunately for us, institutionalized trespassing at Princeton University. Mestizaje, it's interesting that our colleagues could not find a word in English to advertise this event, that is not there. That's in itself very telling, I think. It's interesting and perhaps should be discussed. Why not? Or is there any word? Why the question would be, why is it not used as we do use it and we know about it in Spanish and Portuguese, mestizaje, which is not a very popular term nowadays among academics. But these words are only used by academics, really, because no one, I think very few people would really self-present themselves with a discourse, with a long discourse about mestizaje, although there are traditions that go in that direction, such as. But this is a rare opportunity, I think, to counter perhaps our own academic provincialism and to consider substantive questions, beginning with the word itself, mestizaje, and the problems and the definitions and the presence or the absence of that word. And this encounter, I think, is inviting us to and challenging us to think about other different concepts that have to do with mestizaje, with its reality or absence. And those concepts are, in my view, freedom, democracy, and citizenship in the Americas, among some others. And I think it's important also to keep in mind that this meeting is taking place here, meaning Princeton and in the United States, in 2013. What does it mean to talk about race and citizenship if we are here and from the perspective of the American Academy? I think that's a very important question, at least it is for me, because it's trespassing. What does it mean here? Crossing borders, as my colleague Serge Gruzinski has written very important books about mestizajes in Latin America. And mestizajes also, as Serge has always said, not only real historic mixing of peoples, and Europeans and indigenous and Africans in America. Serge has written extensively about what happened, let's say, in the 16th century and the 17th century and much later. So I will not even attempt to summarize the richness and the complexity of those historical mestizajes and the legal questions and the religious questions and I think the political questions raised by historians, especially his book with Carmen Bernal on mestizajes. But I think it's also a word that is looked, and rightly so, and Pedro mentioned that before, is looked at with suspicion. It is a word that should be, I think, looked at with suspicion. First of all, because it has been ideologized a lot. It is a word that has been used as a synonym for nostalgia for the golden days that never were really, no? Or has been used with a certain cynicism. It is more of an academic word, or we prefer to talk about, I think, very often, as we did today, even at the beginning, about the denial of actual mixing, no? How to use mestizaje when we should be talking about the denial of the mixing itself, no? Which is, and here I have to share, to begin with, one of the words are so important always, of course, as we know, and they shape us, and just like trespassing, but there are other words that have to do with mestizaje and the denial of mestizaje. And I was, before coming into the room today, talking to my colleague Javier Guerrero, and from the Caribbean as well, and we share an expression that we have heard since, I think, various generations have been shaped by that idea in Spanish. Ellos son blancos y se entienden. Which is wonderful and terrible at the same time. But it goes right to the heart of the matter, because in spite of all the mestizaje, the racial hierarchy is very clear. And I like that expression. I've used it in some of my classes, and it takes hours to discuss what it means, really. And I don't know if we are able to grasp it entirely, because it has to do with language, with public discourse, with, I love that ellos, they, power. I heard a lot about that in Cuba as well, one of the most racist countries, in spite of all the rhetoric that has been used to refer to Cuba in the last 4 or 5 decades too. Built-in, it's a built-in racism, and that phrase says so much. Ellos son blancos y se entienden, they are white, and therefore they understand each other very well. It's logos, and it's thought, and it's complicity, and it's power, especially power. And in Mexico, one of our very bright graduate students has told me recently, Benito Juárez really could not be elected president today. He would probably be called a pinche indio, no? And that's revealing too, because that raises an important question about the 19th century. Why was Benito Juárez able to become president? And yet today in Mexico, even though mestizaje was used as a foundation of the modern Mexico, el México mestizo, as the new modern state, nation state, and yet someone like Benito Juárez would not get elected today, and would be despised and just not be able to do anything significant as a political figure. That's one of the questions that we should discuss. Why, in a country where mestizaje has been institutionalized as part of the discourse of the nation state, however, indigenous peoples and also mixed individuals probably would not be at the top of the political power. That's and the same, I would say, would be true in other countries in the Caribbean and in Latin America. I have heard, and I'm sure you have too, all the expressions from our, like I have heard among Puerto Ricanos and Dominicanos, expressions about President Obama, how to describe him. And certainly I have to repeat one that I've heard from Puerto Ricanos like me, un negro parejero, which is another important phrase, no? That reveals that in spite of the celebration of mestizaje, this deep-seated racism is there. And parejero is a very interesting word here because it has to do with equality. I mean, someone who pretends, who wants to be more than he really is, arrogant in that sense. Parejero in the sense of being equal, no? Igualado, that Javier tells me in Venezuela would be the phrase. We say parejero, no? Which is a very disturbing and offensive phrase too. That raises all kinds of questions about this social, racial democracy too. What does that mean? So, one of the forces, I think, would be one of my main questions, that suppress blackness in Mexico and in Central America's mestizaje and in the Caribbean. A denial of blackness and of black historical agency in those countries, shaped by slavery and by the struggle against slavery and sometimes the disappearance of the indigenous communities. But in Mexico, too, what are the forces and why the suppression of blackness in its cultural memory and even among historiographers, historians and in the historiography? What was mestizaje and what is it now, if anything? How about blackness when talking about the legacy of citizenship? Deborah Thomas, here in her book, Modern Blackness, it's interesting that the title is Modern Blackness, Nationalism, Globalization, and the Politics of Culture in Jamaica. And it's a book that raises many questions, and it's wonderful for a discussion too. And she starts in her preface with a question that I understand perfectly because I've heard similar questions. What does it really mean being very, very Jamaican? What does that mean? She encountered that situation there. And then that led her to rethink all the tensions between blackness, Africanness, and Jamaicanness. Competing definitions that I think are part of the questions everywhere. And then the question of mestizaje as a narrative of integration, but then integration, but not democracy. I think we have to keep adding that word and that question there. The political questions that are often dissimulated in words, something that Gayatri Spivak has underscored very often, how words dissimulate or hide political questions. And what does mestizaje mean when it competes with an expression that is used very frequently in Spanish, in the Spanish-speaking countries, mejorar la raza, as an imperative. People have still used frequently. Mejorar la raza, what does it really mean when it's used along with mestizaje? And for me, perhaps the key question, and I said, because we are here in the United States, how about violence? Foundational violence of slavery and mestizaje, that's a key question. Perhaps, I repeat, for me, the question today to be discussed or be discussed. Deborah also discusses violence in her book, and one of her books, and we should bring this into the discussion, violence and mestizaje, violence and citizenship. Not only the violence of, let's say, gangs and drug trafficking, which is very important in the Caribbean and in Latin America, and if we raise the question of citizenship and race to that war, but also the question of the military. For me, an important question. As a Puerto Rican, no? Citizenship, American citizenship, US was granted in 1917. Granted, I don't know if that's the word I should use. I would probably be in danger if there was another audience, and I would say granted. But anyway, 1917, First World War, recruitment, military recruitment, and citizenship. And that's still going on today, because many of the so-called illegal immigrants in this country, the path to citizenship is the military, men and women. And that is very important for mestizos, mulattoes, blacks from all over, becoming an American citizen, and the path, one of the easiest ways, if there's another word I can use there, is the military. And I think that's very important, and that's an experience that brings in the question of colonial legacies, mestizaje, race, and colonialism, and its many legacies. I think that has to be emphasized, that it's not the same to cross the border, trespassing, It is not the same for all social classes, and sometimes crossing the border means immediately joining the military for the family too, and getting that those credentials as one way of doing it. And this is, I think, a key question, and I have probably left for the end. And I think it's related to something that is being studied here. One of the best books that I have read in the last 2 or 3 years on this topic is precisely the book by Michelle Alexander. Her book, and the title is telling, no? The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindedness. A wonderful book, because she is very eloquent and demonstrates how in this country, in the age of color blindedness, and we say Obama himself uses the term post-racial society, but the prisons are crowded with African Americans and increasingly with Latinos. No? So what does it mean, really, that post-racial, what does that mean? Is that mestiçagem, or the repression of mestiçagem and of blackness? What are the consequences for a discussion on civil rights and democracy? It's a whole narrative. It's a word that implies a whole narrative, post-racial. But the facts on the ground are very disturbing. Not only social class differences, very acute, but also the image of the prisons, crowded with African Americans and Latinos. I think that needs to be brought to the table too. And her book, in that sense, I would say, is very important. Speaking from the United States and from the American Academy, I think those two issues, citizenship and the military, very important, and race, and also the question of what does post-racial mean, and what are the implications for affirmative action, for prisons, for everything, because that seems to be a dogma here. And as she says, people accept more and more the idea that the society is colorblind, and it's hard to believe, but it has become sort of a dogma in its way. And last but not least, for me, poetry, of course, because mestizaje has became a very powerful metaphor in literature, in poetry, in Afro-Caribbean poetry, but not only in Afro-Caribbean poetry. And I think it's there is one poet that I like very much, Luis Palés Matos, who already in the early 1930s wrote a poem, a whole book, but a poem that became source of polemics and discussion, because he praised the mulata and the image of the metaphor of the nation as a mestizaje, of course. But he said something that I think is very important in one of the poems, y así estás, mi verde Antilla, un sí es que no es de raza, un sí es que no es de raza, which I find a powerful poem, a powerful verse, and says something about the ambivalence. Un sí es que no es. It's a way of resisting racism, the racism of the elite, and they were very angry at him. They wrote about him. They wanted to kill him, actually, for writing that book. Some of them said he's just bringing a total disorder and instability to what we are trying to do by raising the issue of mestizaje. It was very provocative in those years. But also, I think even today, it's very powerful, because un sí es que no es implies a complexity that many academics, even, and scholars are not so ready to accept, that there is a real complexity here, an ambivalence in un sí es que no es. Yes, but no, no, but yes. In that ambivalence, I think there is the possibility of raising social questions and the need to ask even for more questions about mestizaje, race, and citizenship. What does it really mean? And last, thinking about that too, there is a movement, again, in the US Academy of some of our friends and colleagues who have written on the question of Afro-Latinos. And it's a very important issue, because even within the Latino community, and especially the Latino scholars, and even the Latino programs, sometimes Afro-Latino is not very welcome, because they say, I've heard that it's too divisive, too divisive. But the fact is, and this goes again to the heart of the institution of the university as an institution too, it's very hard to classify in either or, no? And Afro-Latino, the concept itself, which has not been very popular, raises a number of issues, because that's important for the Caribbean and for others too. What does a black Dominican or Puerto Rican or mestizo Cuban, the question of self-definition, self-presentation, do we use that? Do we rather prefer the national definitions or the word Latino? The question is, what does Latino as a term, or Latin America, what does it suppress? Thank you.